star-studded, wonderful program I know you're all very much looking forward to. We've had a wonderful day here at the Truman Library. President's Day is always a wonderful day, but especially when you have such a wonderful legacy to celebrate. And we feel very happy every day of the year to get to celebrate Harry Truman's legacy, but President's Day is always a special time. We celebrated today, as you know, we have a tradition of having cookies that come from certain presidents' favorite recipes, I guess you'd say. And so we had those this morning. They don't last very long, I'll tell you. They go pretty quickly, but we had, it went all the way back, I think 170 years. It went back to President Harrison. I told everyone this morning the cookies are fresher than that. They didn't last, but nevertheless, the recipe dates back to that time, and it was very interesting. People seem to enjoy that. We also had a wonderful experience this morning in that we unveiled the White House Historical Association's 2018 Christmas ornament, which this year is a Truman-themed ornament. And they've done those in order. That started, I guess, in 1981 under Nancy Reagan, and she had the wisdom and foresight to have that happen sequentially, so there was no political decision about whether we would honor one or not. And so it started with George Washington and has come down to, and they've had a few celebrations in between as well, of anniversaries of the White House itself, but certainly this year was Truman, which is great timing for us with our renovation and all that's going on. We're very pleased with all of that. So we had that opportunity this morning. And also, we just want to give you one quick programming note. We have, in 3 weeks, we have opening of our exhibit, Heroes or Corpses. It's President, is that me? Oh, I think we have, they're micing up in the back, I'm sorry. Pay no attention, it's just, do a little soft shoe here, okay, here we go. So anyway, it's a World War I exhibit about Captain Harry and Battery D and his experience in World War I, so we hope you'll come back, and that will open on March 10th, and we'll be happy to have you here for that as well. We're very, very excited about tonight's panel, the Presidency and the Press. We're so indebted and so grateful to the White House Correspondents Association. This program was their idea and their suggestion. You know you're doing something right when somebody calls you up and says, would you like us to send 4 or 5 of the nation's top journalists to do a program at your facility? And I said, we could probably find a way to accommodate that. So this program that you're witnessing tonight is the first in a series of programs that the Correspondents Association is going to be doing around the country. So we feel very honored to have that program launched here tonight. And we especially want to thank Steve Thoma, the Executive Director of the White House Correspondents Association, who worked with our staff to make this happen. And very delighted he's here with us tonight, and with other members of the White House Correspondents Association, who you'll meet very quickly. I was asked to say just a couple of words about, our topic tonight is the Presidency and the Press, which for some reason is on people's minds. I don't know why, any more so than it would be any other time, but it seems to be a topic that gathers some interest. And, it occurs to me that Harry Truman, his relationship with the press was somewhat different than anything we can imagine today. The day that Franklin Roosevelt died and Truman took the oath of office within hours, of course the weight of the world, as he said, had fallen on him, is how he felt, and within a day he spoke to of course they were all men at the time, all the men in the press corps. He called them boys. He said, boys, if you ever pray for me now. And, it's hard for me to imagine something like that happening in our modern time. To think that some president would go out and ask for an interest in the prayers of the White House Press Corps. They might pray privately that the White House Press Corps will be on their side, but nevertheless, I think that's very telling about the kind of relationship that Truman had. And I think, for the most part, and there are scholars on the panel tonight that can address this far better than I, but I think that it's safe to say that Truman had a very warm and cordial relationship with the press. I think he spoke the truth. The line I love is when he said, they always said, give him hell, Harry, and he said, I never gave anybody hell, I just told them the truth, and they thought it was hell. And I think that's kind of how he lived his life, and I think it worked out really well. So anyway, as we think about Truman, and not just his relationship with the press, we think about how much has changed. And as we contemplate a major renovation of the library, in these coming years. We have, as you know, we plan to be reopened with new exhibits and everything here at the library by April 12th of 2020, which is the 75th anniversary of Truman's ascension to the presidency. And there's so many things about Harry Truman that are important today, and to these journalists that you're going to meet. Every day you pick up a newspaper and you read a headline, and every time you see a television news program, you can just about bet that you could make a tie and some connection to Harry Truman. Korea is in the headlines all the time. Israel and the Middle East in the headlines all the time. Civil rights and race relations in the headlines all the time. Electoral strategy, the election strategies that we invoke. All of these issues are things that Truman had to deal with, and he handled them, I think, so well. And it's amazing to me that we still are in a position where we look at these same issues. And I wish that we had some of Truman's wisdom and insight on both sides of our aisle to be able to approach these things a little differently. I'm now going to introduce the panel that is going to be with us tonight, and I'll bring them out one at a time. The first of our panelists is Dr. Betty Winfield. Dr. Winfield is a specialist in political communication and mass media history. She is the author of Journalism, 1908, Birthplace of a Profession, and the award-winning FDR and the News Media. She's a former... She is a former faculty member at the Missouri School of Journalism and Washington State University. And she has held postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard and Columbia. So we feel like she's going to have some nice things to say to us. Appreciate that. Next, we'll introduce Major Garrett, who is the chief White House correspondent for CBS News. He's the substitute anchor of Face the Nation. He's also the former chief White House correspondent for Fox News, White House correspondent for CNN, and senior editor and congressional correspondent for U.S. News and World Report. So welcome, Major. Next, we'll introduce Zeke Miller, White House reporter for the Associated Press. He's a former White House correspondent for Time magazine and the first White House correspondent at BuzzFeed. Zeke has also covered politics for Business Insider. And this important distinction was the editor for the Yale Daily News. I like that. Next, we have Karen Ball. Karen covered President Clinton's White House for the New York Daily News. She was the lead Associated Press reporter on Clinton's 1992 campaign. She broke many stories, including, I think this is interesting, Clinton's tapping Al Gore as his running mate. And she's the first woman to run the AP's State House Bureau in Missouri. And finally, tonight, the moderator for this program is Margaret Talev. She's the president of the White House Correspondents Association. Margaret is also the senior White House correspondent for Bloomberg News. She's a CNN political analyst, past president of the Washington Press Club Foundation, and she previously wrote for McClatchy newspaper. See, I don't see all that they're doing, and I think, did I say something wrong? Have I messed this up somehow? But I guess it's okay. Got your spot right here. Past president, did I mention this, of the Washington Press Club Foundation, and previously wrote for McClatchy and for the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee, and the Tampa Tribune. Now, the thing about Margaret that I need to share with you is the idea to bring this little program on the road was hers, and we owe her a great deal for that. This is, I mentioned, the first in a series of discussions that are going to be held around the country, but we're so grateful that they thought of the Truman Library and that she had this idea, has been in touch with our folks and pulled this together, so we're very happy to welcome them all to the stage, and I'm going to turn it over to Margaret for a wonderful program.
Is this thing on? Yes. I really thank you to all of you for coming out on a Monday night, on a holiday night, on a Getting Colder night, and to Kurt, to Amy, to Jen, to all of the Truman Library and Museum for your great help in hosting this event, and to Steve Thoma, our awesome executive director. If any of you have questions after, Steve's the guy, definitely. Listen, you've met the panel. Before we get started, I wanted to talk to everyone in the audience a little bit about why we wanted to come here tonight, why we wanted to take our little show on the road. The White House Correspondents Association, for most of its 100+ years of existence, has been an organization that the American people think about once a year on one night when the dinner is broadcast on C-SPAN. And the rest of the time, it is an educational organization. We do a lot of outreach. We have students who we give scholarships to, whom we work with. But day to day, a lot of what we do involves sort of the mundane stuff behind the scenes that you don't see, which is the negotiations or discussions that lead up to where the cameras are going to be when the president walks out, how many questions there'll be at a news conference, the sign-ups for a trip on a computer system. And for the last 13 months or so, our organization has taken on, as a result of events larger than any of us, much more interest in the minds of many Americans. And we have gotten there are a lot of opinions about what we should be doing, what White House correspondents should be doing. Some people think that we should be more supportive of the president. Some people think we should be less supportive of the president. Some people think that there should be boycotts of briefings. Other people think that that we are terrible and ask dumb questions in briefings. There are some people who believe that there should be a resistance movement, and reporters who are mainstream reporters should be part of it. There are a lot of opinions and questions about what our organization does, which is unusual for us, but we realize that it has given us a tremendous opportunity, which is to talk more to people everywhere outside of Washington about how they view journalism today, how they view politics today, how you view what your government is doing, and how you think that we as reporters can be asking smarter questions, writing stories about things that you care about, and doing the best version of what our job is, which is to be a conduit of information to the public. The White House is called the People's House. It's supposed to be the People's House, but in 2018, no matter who the president was, there are a lot of modern considerations about security. If you've been to Washington lately, there are 12 layers of barrier outside of the White House. It's very hard to get in. You can get a tour through your congressman, but even if you get the tour, it doesn't mean you'll be able to see anyone you want to see and ask them a question. The White House press corps are supposed to be accessible to every American, so that if you have questions and you can't ask the person involved directly, you can come to us and we can ask the questions for you. And so part of what we wanted to do as an organization, as individuals, was to just get out around the country and meet with people and hear from you. And so I'm talking an awful lot, but what I was going to say is we'll do some moderated conversation. We don't want to spend too much time doing that tonight. We really do want to hear from you about whatever you want to know. If you want to talk about the press, that's fine. If you want to talk about Iran, that's fine. If we don't know the answer, give us your name and number and we'll come find you later. But we really wanted to facilitate a conversation here tonight that we hope can be a role model for other conversations around the country. And we hope that presidential libraries like this great one will be a great place to do that. So thank you. You guys are the experiment tonight, and we appreciate you participating in the experiment with us. So without further ado, we will do the official part, and then we'll do the unofficial part. When it comes time for the question and answers, the only thing I would ask you is, number one, think about what you might want to ask now, and number two, when it comes time, the faster or the more succinctly you ask the question, the more questions we can get in, and so that's great, we appreciate it. So without further ado, I think I'd like to start with Karen, because Bill Clinton wasn't president that long ago, but boy, it sure seems like an eternity. And he also had a very engaged relationship with the press, although it was a little bit different. So I think I'd like to start off our conversation tonight by talking a little bit about what it was like to cover Bill Clinton, the candidate, and Bill Clinton, the president. And when you watch President Trump in action, what similarities you see, what differences you see?
Well, thank you, and again, I'm very honored to be here tonight, too. I actually grew up less than 7 miles from here, right off Truman Road, and ended up going to Truman High School to finish, and my dad used to work at do some hours, some days at the phone company right over here, and they would lean out the window and wait for Harry and Bess to walk by in the 60s, and so it is quite an honor to be here. And my time was with Bill Clinton. I was fortunate enough to work for the Associated Press and cover the '92 campaign from early in that year, and at first there were all of the candidates, Jerry Brown, Bob Kerrey, Paul Tsongas, and then when it became clear that Clinton was going to get the nomination, I was just what they called, the lead AP person, which meant I basically would come home, grab a fresh set of clothes from the dry cleaner, and then just go back to the plane again. And one of the striking things about today's White House and campaign reporters and how blessed we were at the time, we had extraordinary access that reporters on the Trump campaign certainly, and I suppose Hillary's campaign just as bad. It was a long time before she let reporters join her plane or they added a plane. When I covered Clinton on the campaign, I mean, the only thing that separated us meaning the reporters between Bill Clinton and his inner circle was a little kitchen galley. And he frequently came to the back of the plane to talk to us. And it would not be unusual, for the plane to be rocking, and he would just bump right into whoever was next to him. And, I, in fact, was lucky enough to, at times, be called up front because Clinton wanted to play hearts, and they needed a fourth hand, or they needed two hands, and David Marinus, who ended up writing, he won a Pulitzer that year for his coverage of the Washington Post, or for the Washington Post, and then he wrote his book about Clinton. Marinus also went up occasionally, and I don't know if we were just two people who knew how to play hearts or whatever, but there was extraordinary access. And also, I feel very lucky that it was a time when I think the majority of Americans clearly felt like the press corps was a very important part of democracy. And when we rolled into big campaign events, people would look at us, maybe not quite with awe, but we certainly felt glamorous and as though we were respected. And I do feel for the current press corps that that they have much maligned, and it seems very unfair to me because these are people just doing their jobs and trying to bring sunshine to what's going on. And Clinton, I think also, I think it was kind of a turning point in many ways in that campaign and then the White House coverage became, it was a turning point in terms of, faster, uglier, more chaotic. Clinton, I mean, he can't really hold a candle now to the 24/7 stuff that's going on, but Clinton did love to go from 5 in the morning until 2 in the morning, and sometimes you'd hit 10 states a day. And I believe that they were the first campaign to use the phrase war room in terms of having a rapid response team, people on the ground ready to come right back with attacks, and they and you started hearing there was a more coarsening of the culture that I think obviously we've seen just get worse and worse and worse. Anywhere between Mary Madeline calling Clinton a fat, draft-dodging, dope-smoking adulterer to Carville a couple of years later, saying, look what happens when you drag $20 through a trailer park. It started to be a free-for-all in that sense, and I think that that kind of started with Clinton. But we had extraordinary access. As the AP person, not because of me, but because I represented the wire service, I was with Clinton all the time, and I would be almost as if I were a Secret Service agent and holding my tape recorder on every rope line. And he loved to dive into the crowd. And so we wanted every bit of information we got from him. And in fact, there were times late at night on the plane when he would start to come back and we would almost say, please, no more. We've had enough of your words today. You've talked too much already. So, I sit at home and I watch the campaign and political coverage, and sometimes I have oh gosh, I miss it so much, but it really does look so different. I'm not sure I would be cut out for it in these days, and I'll pass with that. Thank you.
So I think this is a great segue, Major, if you can take us a little bit to today, because in some ways those days are gone, and in some ways those days are very much alive. They're just expressed a little bit differently. So give us a sense of what the sort of charisma, engagement, day-to-day relationship with the press and Trump is like, and maybe any way in which it's different than someone watching at home would know.
I proceed. Yeah, can everyone hear me? No?
Are you, oh yeah.
Wrap this, I guess. How about that? How about that? There we go.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Give the TV guy a few minutes to figure out the technology. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm delighted to be here. This is kind of a full circle moment for me because when I was 18 years old, driving with my mother from my hometown in San Diego to my freshman year at the University of Missouri, along the way we stopped here at this library. It was the first presidential library I ever toured. I've never forgotten it. I'm very deeply proud to be here, honored to be asked to join this panel. And just to contrast what Karen said about the access to Bill Clinton during the '92 campaign, Donald Trump flew in his own plane. No reporters were ever on that plane.
Trump Force One.
Trump Force One is what he called it. And the crowds loved it, and the plane was its own banner for the campaign. But reporters were never on that. We flew in a separate plane, and not only was Trump not on the plane that we were on, nobody from his campaign was on the plane we were on. So if you had a question to ask anyone attached to the campaign and you were on the press plane, there was no one to speak to except via text or email or some other form. You could not have any interaction with any senior member of the Trump campaign under any circumstance during the course of a campaign, which is really without precedent in the modern American presidential history. That arm's length relationship carried out through the entire campaign. And I can tell you, having attended more than 70 Trump rallies around the country over the course of 16 months, when we walked in, I guarantee you we were not looked upon with awe. There might have been an A word involved, but it wasn't awe.
Did anyone ever throw one of these at you?
And I'll just leave it at that. But one thing I do want to say before I sort of leap into the Trump part of the conversation, look, every American president has, through one means or another, attempted to tell the press that they're covering him unfairly, push back against what they considered to be excessively nosy coverage of the presidency, or try to find a way to work around the established Washington press corps. Abraham Lincoln, for example, would send letters up from his desk to favored newspapers around the country, letters from the president. They were public letters in which he would announce a policy or an idea to go around the coverage of the White House reporters covering him. A public letter published exactly the way Lincoln wanted them in his favorite papers. A modern equivalent of a tweet, if you would be willing to indulge me in that metaphor. Herbert Hoover was so upset about the coverage he received from the White House press corps, he once wrote a statement that said, "No paper in America should publish anything about the White House other than an official documented statement." That didn't work, but he did it anyway, okay? It is not new for presidents to try to go around, over, or through the White House press corps. That is not a new phenomenon. And it's not a new phenomenon for the American presidency to use whatever technology was available to them to achieve that goal, whether it was FDR on the radio, President Kennedy with television, Ronald Reagan with the television and the sort of atmospherics and the staging of the American presidency, Bill Clinton with the rapid response in 1992, which they brought into the White House. The war room of the campaign became the war room for many of the domestic policy initiatives of the Clinton administration. Barack Obama, oftentimes when I covered him as president, would use social media to announce policy initiatives. I'll never forget when he did a Facebook video to announce a significant change in his immigration policy. He did that aboard Air Force One, bringing a taxpayer-funded videographer into his conference room to videotape his announcement, which was then sent out by the White House while he's in the air, and nobody in the White House press corps had any inkling this was happening at all. I mean, it was a complete leaping over of the entrenched White House press corps because he didn't want to have to answer any pesky questions we might have about the underlying policy. So I just want to say that as a predicate, that so much of what President Trump represents feels so different and feels so out of our normal experience, and it is, but not all of it is. Now, here are the things that are. First of all, the White House press office is not organized around the concept of engaging reporters or providing information beyond what the president says. If you routinely ask people in lower press or the upper press, the whole shop, what are some of the underlying facts, figures, very hard to come by, very hard to get from them because they're not really organized around the idea that informing the White House press corps is a particularly high priority for this president. And oftentimes, the White House spokespeople simply refer to what the president has said on Twitter or what he said in speeches, and that's it. And the White House press briefings have a kind of metronomic quality, like 3 or 4 talking points, and they just sort of go back and forth, and no matter how many different ways we ask the question or come at it from different angles, this metronomic set of answers, 3 or 4 of them, and that's really the extent of the press briefing. Press briefings have shrunk from about an hour and 10 minutes, to maybe 22 or 23 minutes. They are very short, very compressed. And they're built entirely around the communication strategy of the president, which most of the country interacts with through occasional set-piece speeches, but mostly via Twitter, which is just a radical concept for a president communicating not only to the country, but to the world. And it is an exhausting aspect of covering this presidency. It just flat out is exhausting. Because once it was declared by Sean Spicer, once press secretary for the President of the United States, that everything Donald Trump says on Twitter is an official presidential statement, everything has to be weighed and measured and sifted as a presidential statement. The consequential to the inane and everything in between. And that's a big continuum with President Trump, a very big continuum. And it's very difficult as a White House reporter to, especially one who's been hamstrung as I have by covering 4 previous presidents, to get into that rhythm. Because A, there is no rhythm, there is no predictability, and it's very difficult for news desks and reporters to weigh the relative weight of each and every tweet. Is it simply a kind of clarion call in a political matter to his base? Is it a serious policy statement? Is it something he's going to follow up on? Or is it something that's just sort of out there for the sake of being out there? Let me give you a classic example. So I'm working on a book about the first year of the Trump presidency, and one of the more fascinating stories is all the deliberations that went on inside the White House about transgender policy, because there was a significant debate in the Republican majority Congress about whether or not the federal government should pay through the military for those who wanted to transition while they were in the military. And the president was presented a range of options, and he got tired of waiting to sift through the options and just sent out a tweet. If you're transgender, you can't join the military, and those who are in have to go out. Do you remember that tweet? Okay, that was not only a thunderclap for those of us who were covering the Trump White House, it was a thunderclap for the chief of staff, the defense secretary, every lawyer at the Pentagon, and everyone in the White House counsel's office. They had no idea this was coming. None. And then they had to respond to a tweet after having just been in meetings with the President of the United States themselves about this policy. So anything that comes across Twitter can, in an instant, theoretically, fundamentally change American policy. That is completely different. And it makes the job, which is not only built around presidential travel, briefings, presidential speeches, statements, and all the other things, all the normal contours, so fundamentally different.
So, we've gone from Clinton to Trump, but let's go back even a little bit further. This is all FDR's fault, right? But even though I can't imagine FDR like tweeting about, you know, war, but
Hashtag Potsdam.
yeah, exactly.
Yalta.
Right.
And yet, if President Donald Trump were a presidential scholar, I do think he would be interested in some of the ways that FDR dealt with the press and managed his public persona. And I'm wondering, Betty, before we get into tweets, Google, and all modern technology and everything that, thank God for Zeke, none of the rest of us understands in this room, let's talk a little bit about like how FDR would see Donald Trump.
That's, as FDR would say, that's an iffy question.
Right.
I don't answer iffy questions. FDR came in, and people thought maybe that there would not be any press conferences at all because they had become moribund during the 20s, and down to the point that they had written questions submitted ahead of time, and then to the president, from Harding, from Coolidge to Hoover. And one time the press got together and they all submitted the same question to Coolidge, and because they wanted to be sure this question was answered. And he thumbed through each of the cards and he didn't answer it. He said, okay, that's it. So, I mean, there was a discussion in 32 after the election whether or not there would even be any interaction between the presidents and the press. But you've got a very different president who came in there. First of all, a very different personality, that makes a difference. And we had tremendous crisis. I mean, if you ever talk to your grandparents or your parents, it was a horrible time in this country with the Great Depression. And so something had to be done. And in fact, 4 days after FDR was inaugurated, he had a press conference. And what he said, and I find this is an interesting situation now, he talked about the role of truth. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's really important in any time you cover a political figure, a president, the role of truth, how important that is. And so Roosevelt mentioned that in the inauguration. Let me find it here. Okay, here, just a second. He said, "This is preeminently the time to speak the truth." Remember, the banks were closed, it was horrible, okay? The whole truth, frankly and boldly. And that's what he saw the press conferences as being, a way to get accurate information out. And so they were background sessions, they weren't televised, we did have the glimmers of television coming in, but they weren't radio broadcast, they were just background sessions for the journalist. And they were helping them to make sense of all the new agencies that were formed, all the new programs that were being discussed. And interesting enough, unlike today, or unlike previous presidents, the various heads of agencies would argue publicly. They had press conferences too, and they would argue about them. So the public was involved in the discussion by the arguments from Hopkins or from Ickes, and so they would discuss the positive and negatives of various programs. So this happened until World War II, and then in World War II, the government needed to speak in one voice, and that changed the press relations a lot, and it changed it to not having that multitude of voices coming out of the government. And so, in fact, Roosevelt and Truman became very angry when there were dissents among various cabinet members in public. Truman actually even fired Wallace because he and Barnes were arguing about the Soviet Union. And so you cannot, it makes a different time. And I think you need to think about that with Roosevelt and the press. He found it very useful. He found it very useful to talk to the journalists. Journalists were different then too. The journalists not only were just spot news coverage that they had, they represented different newspapers around the country, but there were many correspondents that were there too. This is a highlight, the golden age of correspondence. And so many of them not only covered as a reporter or a correspondent, but they also had a column. And so interpretive journalism really came into forth in the 1930s and 40s. And you needed it in one sense. Well, how do you explain the CCC? How do you explain, these various agencies, AAA or whatever? You needed some way to interpret it. So when you think about political coverage, it's not really what happens, but what is thought about it, what it will do, what will the programs do, and so forth. So those press conferences, as background sessions, would actually became very helpful in fitting in interpretive journalism, which Roosevelt hated. He talked about it in press conferences. Didn't like them going off on their own necessarily to interpret, but it was a given. It was just a given in the 30s and 40s. Unlike what we heard earlier about access, and certainly with Clinton as opposed to Trump, he did provide access. Not only did he provide access, he set a tone so that other cabinet members and other members of the agencies all had press conferences. They all met with the press. They all were able to answer questions. And in fact, in these various sessions and press conferences, sometimes you would hear information that weren't useful to you in covering here in Missouri, being from Missouri, but might be useful to your buddy who's covering from Arizona or some other state because of plans. So it was like a way to share information too, because of them. It's a form of news management too. Don't forget, this is a form of news management, providing access, rewarding by providing access, and giving direct channels for particular viewpoints. And some of the techniques that Roosevelt used actually are used by Trump. In other words, when something awful was going on, or he knew they were going to really hit him on it, for instance, the Supreme Court packing bill that went down to failure, he changed the subject. They came in and he made an announcement about something else to distract them. These tweets, don't forget, are distractive techniques also. They set a new agenda, something new to talk about. So
They work.
And they work. You're absolutely right. They do work. So there's a balance here that takes place when you think about in our democracy between government controls and management, and then what we, the public, need to judge leadership. What we must have to see whether somebody's doing a good job or not, or whether it can help us in voting, can it help us have confidence in the government, and help us make decisions ourselves. Okay.
So if FDR was a leader for his time, in today's time, what's the chicken and what's the egg? Did President Trump create the environment in which media and society are reacting, or did the environment exist because of social media, the death of a lot of local or print journalism, changing society? Is he the driver, or is he just like in the front seat?
That's me.
Yeah, that's you. That's an easy one.
You get the easy one.
Yeah. No, thank you. First off, it's great to be here with this esteemed panel. It's both. Like every chicken egg, there's some combination of what Trump is doing is novel. It hasn't been done before. He is taking advantage of, but at the same time, he's taking advantage of whether it be the coarsening of our society, the discourse over a generation, or changes in media, the changing of the business model. You might have seen your local papers shrinking or disappearing, more of a regional or national coverage rather than local coverage, things like that. All of those changes that, he's exploiting that, all the disruption in our industry and every other industry via the internet. He's using that to his advantage, obviously. But at the same time, he's inventing a whole bunch of new things himself and moving that cycle forward. And somebody asked me, I think if there's a common theme I think of what everyone's saying here is that he didn't invent. Donald Trump didn't sort of wake up one day and sort of discover Twitter, discover going around the press, didn't discover how to reward access or punish other outlets or use rhetoric and change the subject or anything like that. He sort of took the best, borrowed, I don't think intentionally, but sort of by osmosis, by innate knack for this sort of communication, has really sort of taken the best of all of his predecessors, taken the best of how to communicate, or the worst, depending on how you look at it, but sort of as a communications technique for him. It got him to the White House, it got him to the Oval Office, it worked for him. Of media, of politics of the Obama administration, of other administrations, of how to approach the press, how to approach every aspect of society. So I think it's if you ask did he create it? No, but also I wouldn't say he doesn't necessarily directly follow any of his predecessors either. But it's sort of he is the ultimate collector of some of these techniques and tools, and that has benefited him in a way that. We really, I think, as a society and as an industry, as journalists and historians, will have to determine, will the next president use these same tools? Will we go back to the quote-unquote traditional way of doing these things, of interacting interfacing between the press and the White House, between the press and a presidential campaign? I don't know the answer to that. Ultimately, you'll deciding that in 2020.
Because by virtue of the fact that we are wire services, Zeke and I travel a lot on Air Force One, and we are in the pool a lot, which is the group of sort of a reduced footprint of reporters who might go into the Oval Office or something like that when the full press corps can't be accommodated. So we've been talking about the differences in access, and certainly there are many differences. But lest anyone not already know this, it's not like there's no access to President Trump, like literally day to day or hour to hour. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's different from Obama, and maybe even different from our expectations, since, as Major pointed out, there were no reporters on his actual plane when he was the candidate or the nominee, and some uncertainty about whether they would try to blow up that medal once he took office. And to my mind, he realized very quickly what the benefit of keeping the press inside the White House compound was, what the benefit of having a press pool always on call and always at the ready was.
Yeah, I covered the campaign like Major, and we were on a chase plane. We didn't always even chase him. We were sort of often 5 states away from where he was, with no access to anyone. The best place to cover the Trump campaign, ultimately, at the end of the day, in all honesty, was either at a Trump rally and you just stayed in Pennsylvania and just went to every Trump rally in Pennsylvania, or you just parked yourself in the lobby of Trump Tower on these insanely uncomfortable benches for hours on hours, and you just talk to whoever.
Get the taco salad and talk to whoever.
And go to the Starbucks. I mean, that was how you did it. He did interviews occasionally. He'd call you up or whatever. But and the transition, there was I'm sure you saw some of that. The fears on our end, the speculation on the press, some juiced by some of the people around the president at the time. We're going to get rid of the press room or move the press across the street, across the country, into the Atlantic. I don't know, but ultimately, by the time the president, they did their first formal briefing maybe 3 or 4 days before Inauguration Day at the transition headquarters, a couple blocks from the White House, and it went okay for them. It was not the best move, but almost immediately the president got to the Oval Office, saw the room, and he's somebody who's obviously reality television star, understands the media and understands the power of visuals, recognized the power of that office, the power of utilizing that office, that space, and what that can give him, and utilized it more than President Obama, certainly. I mean, when we covered Obama, we would see him, unless he was traveling or giving an official speech or doing an official photo op kind of thing. If he was at the White House, for 4 days straight, just taking meetings and discussing things with cabinet members and getting daily briefings and things like that, we would see him maybe once in 4 days. sometimes we'd almost a whole week without laying eyes on him physically. With this president, that there are occasionally dry spells like that, but more often than not, we are there being called back to the Oval Office, 1, 2, 3, 5 times a day, running back, the staff just like calling over the intercom, like pull to the briefing room doors now, and just like screaming at us because
Now.
they want us there right now because he wants a visual, and oftentimes he'll take questions. We've gone more than a year now without a formal press conference from the president. That said, if you tally up the number of questions that President Trump has answered in Oval Office sprays and on the steps of Mar-a-Lago and things like that.
On the way to the helicopter.
On the way to the helicopter. He's taken on par probably about where, I have to go to Martha Kumar, a colleague of ours, sort of scholar of these interactions, but it's pretty darn close to where President Obama was at that point. These are not the same questions, and there's a difference in that venue and sort of the nature of those questions, in that setting, the power that comes from standing behind a podium and taking questions from the press, and you get a different sort of interaction. Don't get me wrong there. I'm not sort of trying, but there is a change here in the sense that the president values a certain level of interaction with the press. He sees his utility in the press when you don't get us. We're not beating up on him. There's more access to Donald Trump on a daily basis than there was to Barack Obama. It's a different sort of access. I think that's an important.
It tends
piece
to
of
be
conversation.
less substantive, it tends to be less interactive, and it tends, by his design, to be more on his terms.
Absolutely.
The surprise element of when the questions will be allowed.
Who will ask them? You might think you'll get a question, and the aides will tell you, "Oh, you're getting a question," and then it's a friendly outlet or something like that.
But even then, I mean, there's the full press corps, which is a couple hundred, 200-300 people. It's the full sort of regulars who would come in and out on a day-to-day basis. And then there's the pool, which is like 13 or 21, depending if you're on the road or in town. If you're taking questions from the pool, you're taking questions from, at best, 10% of the people you might be taking questions from. So it is, the terms are different, and what you get out of it is different, and yet the frequency is actually much greater.
Well, so just one more beat on that also. There's the Obama administration sort of got pilloried for them when the president said this is the most transparent administration ever.
Yeah.
In a way, just to make the argument here, the Trump administration is in some ways the most transparent administration ever. We have never had this window into the most important piece of presidential real estate, which is the 1 square foot, 1 cubic foot above a president's shoulder, and then we know what he's thinking on. If you look at the tweets of the last 72 hours, we know exactly what he's thinking about everything from a shooting to a Russia investigation, indictments, to Oprah. We know what he's thinking at all times, and those interactions. So I think that it's important to sort of, from our job, to sort of evaluate. There are benefits to that, and there are costs to it, but it's also to sort of have an open discussion about it. It's important to recognize.
Betty wants to say something, although before I pass the mic back, I would just say, as a quick counterpoint to that, but we still don't have any transparency on some of the things that are traditional measuring sticks by which you understand the person who is in power, their tax returns, the comings and goings of who is in the White House, and the issue of continuity to me, because while we do know what the president is thinking or wants us to think he's thinking at any moment, within the span of a day or a week, it often changes and then changes back. And so you have the information, but it's hard to know what the information is necessarily worth sometimes.
It sounds like a lot of noise. A lot of noise is
That's a
going
faster
on.
way to say that.
But I mean, think about it. It's so much information, and this is what we, the consumers, depend upon, is to make sense out of it. And it's overwhelming amount of work, I'm sure, for all of you, when it's just constant, run here, do this, cover this. And the topics are so diverse on the tweets. It's how to make sense of that and put it in some kind of pattern. And so it seems like it would be overwhelming to be a correspondent right now and trying to do a good job and make sense of it and tell the public what is really important here and what isn't.
Social scientists have this concept about confirmation bias, and so I think all of us suffer from a confirmation bias about Trump because he's on Twitter and everything we've said about it, but we have no counterfactual. We have no idea what Bill Clinton would have done with Twitter. Bill Clinton was up till 2 a.m. He thought and wanted to communicate directly all the time. I actually, Karen, what do you think? I mean, I think he would have been a rather engaged and frequent
Well-
Twitter user or social media user, or
Absolutely.
someone who was attracted to, driven by the newest technology, the newest ideas. I have a feeling that if this were available to Bill Clinton at the highs and lows of his presidency, he'd have been right out there too.
Oh, I think so, absolutely. He, you know, you guys made the point well that it's not new for a president to go up or down below the press corps. You know, Clinton tried it and succeeded. Arsenio Hall, Larry King Live. Right after Jennifer Flowers broke, he did the famous 60 Minutes interview. Like, no questions except the ones I can control about, you know, pain in my marriage and all that stuff. And then after he got elected, he would, you know, it became a much tighter noose, and, you know, all of a sudden we're back behind red velvet ropes and far away from him, and I have no doubt he would use it. And I had some notes written, and one of them was, we had no Tom Hanks in the Bill Clinton White House. I know Tom Hanks has bought cappuccino makers for the White House briefing room, right? And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what, Hollywood, they probably wouldn't have liked the Clinton White House press corps very much, because Clinton and Hollywood were very tight, of course. And but I think he would have absolutely used it. And he was up, I mean, many times he was up late at night playing solitaire by himself. And so had he had the phone at his fingertips, yes, no telling what he would have done.
On that delicious note, I think it is time to move to the second portion of our event tonight. So we have two sides. Well, no, we've got one podium. And how do we want to do this? Do you want to pass the microphones around? Or okay, terrific. So let's do this. If you have got a question, don't be shy, but put your hand up. And okay, we'll figure this out. One mic at a time. So when the microphone comes to you, if you're comfortable telling us your name or who you are or a little bit about yourself, that's great. If you want to be anonymous, that's completely fine. If you want to tell us your political persuasion, you're welcome to. You certainly don't have to. And if there's someone specific on the panel that you want to address your question to, please let us know. And just try to keep your questions tight so we have time for a lot of them. Who's the first taker?
I'm Mary Kay Speaks from Independence.
Hi.
I'm an independent. Voted for
That
Gary
works great.
Johnson, in case you want to know. But I'm curious about a few things. I'm really big on national parks. I'm just terrified that they're going to become Trump. And I see those kind of little policy decisions sneaking in. There's no heads up. They just kind of appear. Something's happening at Bears Ears. And I wonder how you get all the policy information ahead. I know you mentioned that sometimes it's hard to do. And how do you find reliable sources? I don't envy Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She's got the most thankless job there, I think. But who are your reliable sources?
Zeke and Major, you guys want to?
Well, for any White House reporter, you cover people in the building, but then you also cover people in the agencies, the interested parties, either organizations. There are a number of environmental groups that sort of get an inkling that things are coming. There was a lot of early warning signs about Bears Ears and Grand Escalante being reduced in size and scope from the Obama administration. So there are a lot of different ways to find information. And as Zeke and Karen knows, you can't just rely on the briefing. If that's all you do, if your entire day as a White House reporter is built around the briefing, you're doing it 100% wrong.
Yes.
That's really the last place you go to get the best information. You get it from the outside, you bring it in and force them to respond to it. But you bring up a very important point about covering the Trump presidency. Politico actually has a column that they run with some frequency. 5 things that Trump did this week you were too busy to pay attention to, or that you might have missed. I mean, all the histrionics, the mania, the tweets, everything else, there are these policy things that keep being moved along. And Politico's actually carved out a space to try to identify these underlying policy developments and keep track of them, even though they were not the headline-grabbing events of the week. And under a different administration that was less manic, they probably would have been, or at least would have gotten some degree more coverage than they do in this current environment. And one of the things I'm trying to focus on my book is that those things that, whether you heard about them or read about them or not, are going to be most lasting from the Trump administration after its first year. Because some things happen that are going to be with us for a good long while. And it is always this very difficult question with Donald Trump. Do you cover the interesting or do you cover the important? And there's a tremendous volume of both. But because he knows, because he's really our first president who was a celebrity first, that's really an important factor. He was a celebrity first on his own right, and he understood celebrity culture, and he understood celebrity culture's interaction with politics. So he comes with a baseline understanding of celebritydom and what celebrity can do and how it can project itself before he became a political actor. And so he merges these two worlds in a way that we've really never seen before. Much more a powerful celebrity than Ronald Reagan was. Ronald Reagan had a sense of the art form, but he wasn't a fully formed celebrity. He was known, but not a celebrity. Donald Trump was a celebrity. And he acts and uses his presidency in part because of his instincts as a celebrity. So he knows how to create lots of different areas of interest while he's doing all sorts of other things that are important. And being able to focus on that is a manpower issue, a person power issue for every news organization in Washington, which are mostly smaller than they used to be. 30 years ago, CBS, the company I work for, had a producer in every agency in the federal government, a producer who only covered the EPA, for example, or the Interior Department, for example, or the Agriculture Department, someone who was there every day, interacted with the secretary, the deputy secretary, the undersecretaries, and just compiled information all the time. Did it make air every day? Of course not. But it was part of the institutional knowledge that the network had. We don't have that anymore. It all falls to me and my colleagues at the White House. That's similar to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all the news organizations that are smaller in number than they used to be, which goes to one of Zeke's earlier points about that's another advantage this president has. He knows the press corps is smaller and more overworked than ever, and the interesting can be up here while the important can sometimes get overshadowed. And that's one of the really great, the biggest challenges, one of the biggest challenges of this administration.
I just wanted to pick up very briefly on one other part of your question. I think I picked up on the difficulty in sort of how do you know who to trust and the different sources there. And that's something I'm sure we all struggle with every day on the White House beat. It's not a new struggle, but and one of again, an interesting difference between this administration and previous ones. If in the Obama administration, if you got two people to tell you something, you can pretty much bet the bank on it. With very, very, very rare exceptions. Maybe if you had three sources, you were gold. In this administration, you can get three people to tell you, we're going to bomb North Korea tomorrow, or we bombed North Korea yesterday. You just haven't heard about it yet. Things there's an element of where some people aren't in the know. Some people are willfully, trying to manipulate the press, trying to discredit the press, trying to fight internal battles through the press. So they're passing off, negative, derogatory information to discredit colleagues, or trying to set the reporters up. It's a different environment that we're in. It's not necessarily new, but it's certainly more extreme than we've seen before. Different administrations and political figures have tried this tactic in the past, but it's an interesting, how do we know who to trust? We talk to a lot of people, and then we use our judgment, and if we aren't confident on it, we sit on it. I mean, all of our our brains are filled with things that we're chasing that we can't tell you yet, and we aren't going to tell you because we can't stand behind it yet, and that's why you read outlets, and you should read outlets you trust and watch outlets you trust, and that's why good journalism matters now maybe more than ever. But that's what good journalists do, and they don't just publish rumor; they publish facts, and that requires being sure of what we report, and that means in this administration talking to 10 or 15 people before we run with something sometimes, not just 2 or 3.
The only other quick thing I'd add before we take another question is any member of the public can read the Federal Register. You can do it online. You can sign up for alerts. It's really tedious, but it's like a font of information if you can slog through it. And also that elections have consequences, and the executive branch has a lot of leeway if it doesn't involve a law that Congress has passed, that a president has signed that, you know, rules something out, or if it doesn't involve an appropriation that Congress controls. So whether it's judicial nominees or whether it's stuff that falls within executive power, anything from parks related to foreign policy, a sitting president, particularly if the Congress is of the same political persuasion as they are, can do a lot. And many Americans agree with the things that he's doing, just not you. Maybe not some people in this room. Anyway, thank you, great question. Let's see, can we get over to this side of the room?
Most of all, thank you for putting this presentation on. My name is Gene Traylor. My spouse Sandy and I across the border from Park, Kansas. At the recent Davos conference, one of the high-ranking, probably world-known, he wasn't identified, individuals was having a conversation about the president, Mr. Trump, how he was perceived and how America, which had long been the world leader in so many different areas, was reacting to his antics. And this gentleman said, first of all, we don't pay any attention to what he says. Secondly, we don't listen to the United States anymore.
Right.
They don't matter anymore. My question, which probably doesn't have an answer, how many decades do you, any or all of you, believe it will take for the United States to regain that preeminence in this global world we live in?
Who wants to take that easy one?
Well, I'd like to say, well, two things. First of all, I have 3 teenage daughters, and I think they looked at me with this necktie on as though I had antlers coming out of my ears. And I am wearing this out to honor a reporter named Michael Kelly, who worked for the New York Times on the Clinton campaign, went on to cover work for also the Atlantic and other organizations. He died in 2003 covering the Iraq War when the military vehicle he was in turned over and he basically drowned in a creek along with the servicemen he was with. And he was not an enemy of the people. He was one of the biggest patriots I've ever known. And I'm somewhat out of the business now. So I'm not criticizing Trump. I still try to stay apolitical, although I am criticizing Trump here. I mean, I think that his trying to sow discord and hatred of the media is so dangerous and so vile. I don't know any, there are other reporters who've died on the job too, and I won't list them all. And my problem with some of my friends who, I get that they didn't like Hillary Clinton. I'm not I understand all the reasons why she did not get elected. I never understood the Make America Great Again, because in my opinion, America is great. And it's always been great, and we're still the most powerful country in the world, and everybody wants to come to America. And have we lost some standing on the world stage? Yes, that's what people are saying. I don't think it will take very long for America to recover at all. I think that the United States of America is always going to be the world leader, and whether this is a hiccup or not, I mean, I don't think he does long-term damage to the United States. Maybe I'm just being overly hopeful. Major, what do you think?
Well, that was said at Davos, and that it was said is true. That it is true, I'm not sure about. I mean, I still think the United States is an enormously influential player in the world, economically and militarily for sure. And I can tell you, having traveled in Europe with President Trump and watching him speak to NATO leaders, and when he was in Saudi Arabia, changed the overall orientation of that part of the world toward Iran and toward Israel. That's still an aspect of American influence. And it is changing under President Trump, understandably. The world is reacting to him in different ways. But that doesn't by itself diminish America's standing in the world. Now, when that person in Davos said, we don't pay attention to what he says, there are plenty of Republicans in Congress who say exactly the same thing. They say, they've said this out loud, I'm not speaking out of school, they say, we don't care what he says, especially on Twitter, we only care what he does. And what he says on Twitter and what he does are oftentimes two different things. So it's not as if European politicians are the only ones reacting this way. Donald Trump's chief of staff, John Kelly, has told me to my face, I don't deal with the president on Twitter. I deal with the president everything up and to Twitter, okay? I manage the flow of information to the president, and what he tweets is his business. My job as chief of staff is to give him information, let him make decisions, implement the decisions he's made. My job is not to run his Twitter account, okay? So even the chief of staff of the president of the United States doesn't necessarily pay attention or live or die by what the president says. That doesn't make him any less powerful.
May or may not be the right course for John Kelly to be taking.
It may or may not be.
Throw that out there. That's a possibility.
But that approach to the president and what he says is not unique in its form of expression in Davos. It's commonly found on Capitol Hill. You can even find those who believe it and operationally live by it who work directly beneath the President of the United States. To your larger question about American preeminence, Chinese President Xi knows America is still a very powerful country. When the President was in Mar-a-Lago with his summit with President Xi, during the middle of dinner, he said, excuse me, I need to stand up and go out here for a few minutes. Came back and said, by the way, I just had a press briefing. We've just launched 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria. The Chinese can't do that. America is the only country that can, on behalf of a established moral principle or predicate, chemical weapons, take action like that, and then sit down with the Chinese and say, I'm sorry, I had to just leave and take this massive military action that sort of explains a moral proposition for the entire world. China can't and doesn't do that, all right? That's still a big difference between however economically powerful, however militarily powerful or ambitious China is, it's still not the United States in that sense.
But Betty, America wasn't like born able to do that, right? I mean, World War II had a little something to do with it. So
Well, the Marshall Plan, certainly that Truman pushed, made us extremely popular post-World War II. But I don't know how many, do you all travel a lot outside the U.S.? Yes. And when the taxi driver brings up your president, when the clerk at the hotel, when anyone you ask, it's not positive right now. I'm telling you, as someone who went to 4 countries this past year, it's not positive. So I don't know whether that means something in a big picture. It's not a statistic. It's not a public opinion poll. But when they say something like that, and that's how Roosevelt collected information in the country before we had public opinion polls that were refined, you do pay attention to it. You do listen to it. I'm not sure we're really very popular right now in a lot of countries. Not every country, obviously, but a lot of countries.
Just one small historical note on that, because I've been doing some research on this. So we all remember Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. What we may not remember is the day before that, 500,000 people protested in the streets of Berlin. Half of the city was shut down. They were not protesting on behalf of Ronald Reagan, the United States of America. They were vociferously protesting against Reagan, calling him a warmonger and a threat to European peace. The day before, one of the most historic statements President Reagan ever uttered, a maybe rhetorical turning point of the Cold War, 500,000 people were screaming their lungs out about how America was ruining Europe and a threat to world peace. That's just a contextual fact about how sometimes the American presidency carries with it burdens that are larger than what may be reflected in the public attitudes of any particular country at any particular given time.
Zeke, you want to say anything?
No.
And as we move the microphone over to the middle of the room, I would just say that I think that one of the kind of pivots that this question goes to, and you know your own question, you said you don't know if we'd be able to answer it because history is the judge of this, is the question of U.S. engagement, right, on issues, on global issues, whether it's global trade, the global economy, involvement in security issues,
Migration,
climate, right?
immigration.
That if the U.S. pulls back or is a disruptor or says we're not doing this anymore, you guys do it, does that create space for other countries to step in and then take a more eminent role? That might be what you're asking. So I think it's very early. I know no one will believe this, but it's actually only 13 months into this presidency. And so we'll come back in 3 years and do this again, and we can bring it up again. Yes, let's get your microphone.
Presentation to the University J schools.
Will we be doing that?
Yes.
That's a great idea. If you'll draw up a list of J schools. No,
University of Kansas, University of Missouri.
are you asking because you think that the upcoming generation of journalists needs to?
Your insights.
Awesome. Thank you.
We'll go wherever there's
Thank
a
you.
free meeting.
They actually, let me say something about Missouri. We do have courses on political communication,
This kind of presentation.
but we bring in all sorts of journalists who are actively working in there. Major Garrett goes there all the time, and so they do that, and they do have seminars on that, and they do spend time on the presidency and the media. There's a whole seminar on that I used to
I'll do a
teach.
little plug for the WHCA actually, since you asked, which is that the Correspondents Association does have a scholarship program, and we bring our scholars to the dinner every year. We put them on stage. Traditionally, they shake hands with the president when the president's there, and so. But we have been at work to expand our program because we would like to be in more states, and ultimately, I hope one day that any kid in any state who is studying journalism will have some kind of a pathway to the Correspondents Association to build relationships and networks and be able to have a mentor if they want a mentor.
Yeah, we
insights
also
on the
pair
job.
up the scholarship winners with current journalists on the White House Speed, and they develop relationships, and often that's a pathway to internships and jobs down the line. So we've seen some of that already in the past 2 or 3 years of doing that.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name, I'm back here.
Oh, yes, hi.
My name's Tom Jumps. I used to be a journalist, and I taught journalism in high school. My question is on a very personal basis. I would have a very difficult time at this point in being objective in relationship to Donald Trump. How do you do that in your daily reporting of his personality and of his policies?
Do you mean you would have a difficult job because of his public attitude toward the press, or because of everything? I mean, I don't,
Well,
why do you say that?
particularly toward the press, but in everything in general.
Thanks for your question. Gentlemen?
I think that's an important question. And gets to sort of the purpose of one of the reasons why we're doing this panel to begin with. Yeah, I don't mind being attacked. I don't mind being criticized. It's part of the job. There's a line, and there's a line this president has crossed multiple times. At this, in violating the norms of the way the president talks about all sorts of things, and the way the president talks about the media, and trying to destabilize the institution of the American American press. But at the same time, I'm not looking for an easy ride. I don't mind. It's our jobs, I think, to take it in stride and be professional and answer occasionally unprofessional comments with the utmost professionalism. And I think that's what we all try to do every single day. You look around the briefing room, you look at the coverage coming out of this White House, you're seeing some of the best political journalism, in some cases the best political journalism ever, sort of in-depth understanding of what the administration is doing in real time, putting it in context, historical context, in real time. That I think we get paid all the time to sort of set aside our emotional responses if we and it's our job, and when our professionalism is under attack, to be as professional, to be even more professional in the face of that. I think that's the way I certainly look at it.
I think it's fair to say I have a unique perspective on that question. In this one sense, and I'm probably going where you're not exactly expecting me to go. It was mentioned when I was introduced that I was the senior White House correspondent for Fox News. Some of you may remember the newly christened Obama administration in 2009 described Fox News as a propaganda arm of the Republican Party and therefore an illegitimate news organization, and these are their words, not mine, that they were at war with. Okay, that's the President of the United States and everyone who worked beneath him, President Obama, saying they were at war with the journalistic organization, Fox News. Now, you may agree or disagree with what either the president said or what Fox News represented, but I was the senior editorial representative of that network. I'm the same journalist now as I was then. But because I was the most visible correspondent for that network, indicted by implication from everything the White House said. So I have an experience with not one but two administrations telling me to my face that I'm an illegitimate reporter who should not be believed and am fundamentally dishonest and am biased by my very nature. Not one but two administrations. So I've lived through this. And I would just say the generalized topic of hostility to the press is a lot more au courant now than it was in 2009, when many of my colleagues looked at me and said, well, good luck.
I never said that. I never said that.
You're doing okay, Mage, all right? Fine? We're heading out the door, but you keep struggling there.
Let the record reflect that Margaret, on multiple occasions, passed questions in the
I did yield my
Obama
time
briefing
to
room.
Fox a couple
Yeah,
of times.
you know,
It's
so
a
no,
For collegial bunch.
and it was, I'm just saying that it was an issue, but not an issue, okay? I did get sympathetic treatment from my White House colleagues, but it wasn't a topic. It wasn't like, oh my God, what's happening? There wasn't that kind of reaction at all. So like, well, Obama's at war, okay. And when that war, their word again, not mine, ended, when President Obama gave me an interview along with every other network correspondent, and of all places, Beijing, the AP wrote about it out of New York with my name in the lead. Major Garrett gets an interview with President Obama, war over. And Karen and Zeke will understand this. I thought I had to die to get my name in the AP lead. So, to Zeke's point, and the most important word I think that Margaret spoke tonight was opportunity. Look, everyone is paying very close attention to this presidency and its interaction with the news media. It is our time to be the best we've ever been, and to be as level-headed as we've ever been, and to be as not emotional as we've ever been. We don't have the luxury of emotion. We only have the obligation to carry out the First Amendment under all of its privileges and consistent with all of its responsibilities. And that's all I try to do every single day.
I would say a couple things. One is that no president is ever your friend, and as both of these gentlemen, my colleagues, have said, you know, you don't do your job to be liked or validated by the president, and you know you're doing your job well if they get really angry with you, but they can't really say why. So that's like a good sign. I do think that what's different, what President Obama would do is President Obama would publicly speak about the importance of a robust free press and democracy, and when he'd go to other countries, he would always show that side. Partly because he believed it, partly because he knows that that empowers him and also sets an example for stability in the world. And so we could be at home at the White House, and they could be doing all the stuff White Houses do, leak stuff to friendly people, punish people who stuck it to them, circle the wagons, all that kind of stuff. But the public message was always, well, you know, these guys, sometimes they're a little tough on me, but what they do is important. And that's not what President Trump does. And what President Trump does objectively is much more destructive to the fabric of society, the fabric of a democracy, the ability for the public to trust facts. And being able to trust facts is incredibly important, and how society works. But having said that, I think it's a mistake for any journalist to try to judge which presidents were on their side and which were not. No president is on journalists' side. Every president is weighing their instincts about how best to govern and lead and what's best for the country against their instincts about themselves, about ego, about political power, about how history remembers them, about how to get stuff done. And our job is to help explain to people what's really going on when anyone is in charge, why they do the things they do and what the implications are. Sometimes it feels easier than other times, but when it starts feeling too easy, you're probably making a mistake. Right now it feels really hard, so we're all trying to do the best job we can, I think.
I want to add to that a minute, which is an understanding of a free press. I mean, and presidents have different understandings. Of course, they're going to have to deal with them. I mean, Washington did, okay, all the way from the beginning. But two things that are going on now, and that is the legal aspects of trying to open up the White House logs, which Obama had opened, and then Trump closed, so you didn't know who the visitors were, supposedly. And then secondly, is a tweet a public forum? In other words, can the public interact? If it's sent out there as a public forum, there's a lawsuit right now on whether a tweet is, in other words, people should be able to enter the public forum. It's closed now. I mean, it's very protectively closed to like thinkers. So those are two things to think about understanding free press.
Well, and I'd just like to say, you know, I worked for the Associated Press for 10 years as well, and you know, whether you deep inside might be a little bit more left-leaning, or, you know, Brit Hume would talk, you know, openly about being very, you know, yeah, I'm a little bit more conservative. I'm older now. I'm not the agitator I used to be. But I think everybody thought he covered right down the middle, because we are trained to not let our emotions, you know, get involved in the coverage. And you know, that's just part of our training. And I think that if you, I tell my friends, and you know, you can't watch the talk shows at night. Okay, that's entertainment. That's not really news. You have to read the Journal or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, the Washington Post. You got to watch the networks. The wire services are credible. You have to do a little bit of work to figure out who is credible. And it is unfortunate that we have people within the Trump administration talking about alternate facts. And, you know, one of the things that I would find very difficult if I covered the Trump White House would be that I do think that these presidents, in large measure, you know, you can tell a lot about them by who they have working for them. And somebody like Marlon Fitzwater for Bush 41, or Mike McCurry for Bill Clinton, they would have never stood at that podium and, you know, openly lied about the numbers of the inauguration parade, or stood there and said, haven't talked to the president about that. Well, you'll just have to base it on the tweet. That didn't come up when I was talking to the president. I mean, just purposefully try to, what is so interesting is, you know, he's so busy talking about, you know, nothing happened with Russia, when we all know that Russia was trying to sow discord, and he's so openly trying to sow discord and get so many people to hate the press. I mean, it would be a little bit hard to cover it, but, you know, as an outsider now who mostly works for my kids and my public schools, if I had to write about the tax cut, I could very easily write, okay, well, here's the pros, here's the cons. I mean, that's what I was trained to do, and I could write about immigration that way. I can write about abortion or choice, whichever way you want to call that. I can write it. I know how to write a very straight story and keep those emotions out of it. And I do think it is a very, opportunity is great. And I agree. I would tell any young journalist that it is a fabulous time to go into journalism. I think that we have a great opportunity to do some of the greatest work ever now. It's a great time to be a journalist.
Amen. We have time for one or maybe two more questions, so let's go for it. We can try to do a speed round if we go really fast. Hi.
Hi, my name is Dawn Wade. I'm a retired federal lawyer. Whenever I am in the presence of folks who've had FaceTime with the president, and one such person had been an acting director of the CIA.
We can hear you.
My question is, do you have any reassuring thing to say about the president's mental health?
Major.
Look at all these folks. They're just ready to dive in on that one. You see everyone, profiles in courage right up here. Well, first of all, Robert Gibbs, when he was the press secretary, used to say all the time, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a banker, I'm not an astrophysicist, whenever he wanted to deflect a question. Well, obviously, I'm not in any way clinically capable of answering that question. I can tell you what people who work closely with the president tell me. This may reassure you or it may not. That he has his ups and downs. He watches a ton of television. He has a high velocity sort of personality. He is unpredictable, but he asks lots of questions, takes advice seriously, and on really big matters does not act as rashly as you might fear. For example, on the question, I referred to this earlier, about Syria and the missile strike. He had 3 separate national security meetings on that, and a separate private briefing he wanted in the Oval Office from General Kelly, who was at the time the Secretary of Homeland Security, General Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Defense Secretary Mattis. So 4 briefings. After the second one, most of the people in the Pentagon and most of his national security team thought the president should be ready to go. But he wanted another briefing, and he wanted to ask another layer of questions. So he went through a very deliberative process on that. And I'm told by those who participated in those meetings, he asked a lot of the best questions about, well, what if Russians are there? What if we damage planes? What if they fire on our ships? What do we do? What are the various countermeasures we either have to think about or things that we might set in motion that we haven't war gamed right here around this table? It was a deliberative process that didn't feel in any way, shape, or form to the people who were fearful that it might, because they'd never dealt with the president on a question like this before, didn't know what to expect. They thought he was actually more gradual, more granular, and more curious than they expected. I don't know if that reassures you or not. It's one example. It's not everything. But that is something that they've conveyed to me in the process of research to this book I'm putting together. And they have said to me in that sense, it was better than they thought it might be. And I'll leave you with that.
Let's do one more question before we go, and then I'd just like to say this as a preface before everyone gets up. We didn't get a chance to talk about this very much in this interactive phase, but all of us, particularly the 3 of us who are in the trenches every day, really would like to know from you how you think that we could be improving our reporting, the kind of issues that we write about, how we interact with you. And when we are done here, we are going to hang around. We really, really welcome your input if you would spend a couple minutes and just come talk to us afterwards. Or you can reach us by email or Twitter. But anyway, but so let's do one more question.
Hi, my name is Vicki Smith.
Hi, Vicki.
I enjoyed most of the performance tonight in the talks that you gave. However, I'm a conservative Republican, and it sounded to me like it was a roast for President Trump, with the exception of Major's last statement. That's my opinion. I don't have a question.
Okay, let's take one last, thank you very much for your input. And if we could do one last question, that'd be great.
Thank you. My name is Mark Armato, and just an old retired history teacher. And I guess my question is that I think in the last year or two, objective truth, provable facts have taken a beating. That we're constantly in this struggle trying to discern what is reality. This president hasn't helped that. And so the fact is, much of the country don't trust you. Now, I trust my paper when I read the articles. I trust that there was some real research and objectivity went into that. I respect the editorials that I'm reading and the various opinions that I'm reading. But there's a segment of society right now that refuses to accept provable facts, evidence, and so forth. And so that to me is a huge danger in this country right now. It threatens the Constitution, it threatens our very concept of what is truth. And this president's not helping. So what do you do as journalists, to try, I know you're trying to do your best, but people aren't buying it. A lot of people out there are just not buying it. What do you do? How do you, I would argue you keep doing what you've been doing, but is it good enough?
Well, the only thing I can do there is to explain to you maybe how we do it. I'll start by telling a little story, and this is a little bit about me. But about 7 hours and change after the president was sworn in, you might have heard there was a pool report that went out. We were in the Oval Office. A pool report is sort of the note that goes from the 13 or 21 members of the who are sort of chosen to go or selected to go into the Oval Office on a rotation, because you can't have 300 people in the Oval Office. You can see the replica over there wouldn't work. It reported out that the MLK bust wasn't there. Didn't see it. It came out and sort of got garbled in that process where it didn't see it, became it wasn't there. Within 27 minutes, before even a White House official even noticed that report had been out there, it was already corrected on our by us. We're wrong. Not the first time I've been wrong. It certainly won't be the last time I'll ever be wrong in my lifetime. But when we're wrong, what journalists do, and sort of and how we do, how we ensure that facts are facts and are our objective, and we check our biases at the doors. When we're wrong, no matter what we're wrong on, we shout it from the rooftops. I engage in a back and forth, with the president and the press secretary on Twitter. Sort of did, as many mea culpas as I possibly could publicly, sort of harangue myself in public, because that's what we do. Because that's how we prove our objectivity. We prove our we prove our professionalism. We prove that we can be trusted. Is that we're willing to admit when we're wrong. And when you see a correction in the newspaper, we don't. There's no law that says we have to correct them. We do it because that's what we do. We're there to report facts. We're there to inform the public. Even when that makes us look bad because either we got something wrong, somebody told us something incorrect. Sometimes it's not our fault. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it really is our fault. We should have known better. Sometimes we just didn't have enough coffee that morning. But when we're wrong, we shout it from the rooftops, and that's I think how we as journalists do our jobs to stand up for the truth, stand up for facts, and it doesn't. We're not going to be right 100% of the time. We're human. But when we're wrong, we'll let you know, and call us on it, because that's often how sometimes in a copy you'll misidentify a city or a state or the name of a high school or spell somebody's name wrong. Tell us, because we'll correct it, and we depend on you too. We would depend on an informed public and an informed electorate to help us do our jobs better. So call us on it, because we want to call ourselves to it. We want to hold ourselves to that standard.
I think that the most important thing that we can do is to work very hard at getting it right the first time. And as Zeke said, if there is an error, to correct it immediately and let the world know. I also think it's one of the most important things that we can do is to be connected to people outside of the building that we cover, whether it's you, whether it's Vicki, to listen to critics, to listen to people who think we're doing a great job, to listen to people who are confused about what we're doing, or to listen to people who feel cut out of the process and don't think that we are writing about the things they care about, and to try to get that feedback and incorporate it into how we do our job. So I hope in some small way that what we're doing tonight is part of that exercise and can help us as a group of correspondents, but also as an industry nationally to begin looking for other ways to reconnect with people so that there is that bond of a relationship and some of the trust that comes with that connection. But you have asked kind of the central question for us of our time, right? There's more information than ever and more ways to get it to you than ever. There's also more groups on the fringes that can mislead, and there's more opinion, and that all leaches into the core of what we do, which is straight, mainstream, objective news. For a consumer of news, that blurs together. It's very confusing, and it is the core challenge for us, because if you don't trust us, what we're doing doesn't matter, and we want what we're doing to be true and to matter. So thank you all so much.